We tend to believe power acts like a mirror. The common assumption is that granting someone authority simply strips away their social constraints, exposing a secretly flawed personality they were hiding all along. Modern neuroscience presents a different reality. Decades of research show that power acts as a physical agent, reshaping the neural pathways of a healthy human mind. Corruption is rarely a hidden moral failing of the individual. It is a predictable, biological reaction to the specific environmental exposure of holding authority. Social psychologist Dacher Keltner spent decades tracking this transformation, identifying a specific dynamic he calls the power paradox. The paradox begins with how leaders are chosen. Society typically grants authority to people who demonstrate high levels of empathy, collaboration, and a sharp attunement to the needs of others. But the sustained act of holding that power reliably destroys those exact same prosocial traits. If ordinary, well-intentioned people are biologically destined to lose their empathy the moment they take charge, how does anyone lead without losing their humanity? The neurological shift begins the moment you acquire power. It activates what biologists call the brain's approach system, a neural network built to motivate an organism toward resources and status. This schematic shows how the approach system floods the mind with dopamine, initiating a reward program biased toward action. As the balance tips, the leader feels an intense sense of efficacy, but measurably loses sensitivity to risk and consequence. This biological shift feels like a promotion in effectiveness. The dopamine surge provides a sense of security and control that masks the way it is simultaneously hollowing out the leader's internal checks. There is a severe biological cost to running this new dopamine engine. The human brain is incredibly economical, and in the presence of power, it stops investing metabolic energy in social monitoring. When you lack power, your survival depends on others, so you pay close attention to their emotions. Once you hold power, you no longer rely on subordinates for your own security. Because you can afford to ignore their emotional states, your brain simply stops tracking them. Neuroscientist Michael Inzlicht documented this exact drop in neural activation. He placed individuals in functional MRI machines, primed them to feel either high or low power, and showed them images of people in physical distress. These side-by-side brain scans visualized the result. The subjects primed with high power showed significantly reduced activation in the somatosensory cortex and the anterior insula. Those are the exact neural regions where we physically simulate and feel another person's pain. The powerful leader does not usually decide to become intentionally cruel. Their literal physical capacity for empathy simply atrophies through lack of use. This empathy deficit warps how a leader perceives reality. It triggers a cognitive blind spot called the fundamental attribution error, the tendency to attribute someone's behavior to their internal disposition rather than their external circumstances. An insulated executive starts to look at a struggling employee and assumes they are lazy or incompetent. They completely miss the structural constraints that are actually causing the employee's struggle. As the leader becomes more insulated, the organizational culture begins to prioritize role compliance over individual judgment. In these environments, subordinates often enter an agentic state, viewing themselves merely as tools of a legitimate authority, and shifting the moral weight of their actions to the person giving the orders. Combine an insulated leader who is blind to suffering with subordinates who have abandoned their moral responsibility, and you create a perfect engine for institutionalized harm. So, is every leader doomed to this biological decay? Research tracks people who manage to hold immense authority for decades without succumbing to this neurological erosion. The difference often depends on the psychological orientation the person brings into the role, specifically whether they rely on personalized power or socialized power. As this diagram outlines, personalized power treats authority as an entitlement used for self-interest, feeding directly into that isolating dopamine loop. Socialized power frames authority as stewardship for a larger cause, radiating outward to connect with a wider network. Resisting the biological pull of power requires a deliberate commitment to this socialized orientation. It means substituting institutional structure for the intrinsic motivation that power destroys. Because the brain naturally drops its empathy, organizations must build artificial, external structures to force leaders to remain tethered to reality. The first structural defense is what researchers call a circle of candor. This requires a leader to cultivate close relationships with individuals who do not depend on them for a paycheck or approval, ensuring a constant stream of honest, unfiltered feedback. At the larger organizational scale, there is a second structural defense, psychological safety. Pioneered by researcher Amy Edmondson, psychological safety is an institutional climate where employees can raise concerns, report errors, and challenge decisions without fearing retaliation or losing their standing. Designing structural safety gear prevents cognitive isolation, providing accountability long before a moral failure occurs. Power serves as the essential architecture for large-scale coordination, providing the collective action that individual effort alone cannot achieve. Ancient civilizations understood this biological vulnerability. The architects of the Athenian democracy and the Roman Republic designed elaborate systems of rotating constraints specifically to combat the cognitive distortions of unchecked authority. Managing power is never a completely solved problem. It is a permanent, multi-generational maintenance task. Protecting your humanity under the pressures of authority requires the active construction of systems that account for your brain's predictable blind spots.